By the time the sixth storm rolled in, most families had given up on keeping the dust out. But Walter Grady hadn't, not because he was smarter, but because he couldn't bear to hear his daughter cough one more night. Before we dig into this one, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet survival move you, join us again tomorrow for another tale that didn't make the papers. The first thing the dust took was color. Fields turned gray, skies turned to soup, and every window pane wore a film so thick it felt permanent. Walter Grady had stopped wiping the glass weeks ago. What was the point? The dust always found its way back, no matter how tightly you sealed the sill. He stood on the porch, his boots buried ankle-deep in silt that used to be wheat rows, watching the wind snake across the plains. His daughter, Rachel, just 10, coughed behind him, a dry, scraping sound that made his spine tighten every time. It was the kind of cough that didn't stop, not at night, not after water, not even when she slept. If she slept. Neighbors said she had dust fever, called it a phase, said all the kids were coughing these days. Walter didn't believe in phases. He believed in patterns. And the pattern was this. First came the dry winds, then the dust, then the cough, then the silence. The Bakers lost their boy in March. Mrs. Coombs was buried last week, lungs packed like flour sacks. But nobody blamed the storms. They blamed weak lungs. So when Walter began soaking rags in vinegar and nailing them around the doorframes, they called it eccentric. When he started crafting masks out of flour sacks, old wool, and beeswax, they called it desperate. Maybe he was. In the barn, Walter kept his work secret. He stitched in the dim light of a carbide lamp, hands trembling from too much coffee and too little sleep. He folded the cloth in layers, testing airflow by breathing through it himself, marking with charcoal which ones let the least dust in. He had no blueprint, only a memory. A farmhand back in Missouri who'd covered his face with damp cloth during a cattle dip said it helped with the fumes. If it kept out poison, maybe it could keep out dust. Rachel helped where she could. Small fingers were good for threading. She never asked what it was for. She just coughed and worked and watched the sky change. That night, Walter tacked oiled canvas over the window panes, stuffed wet towels under the doors, and hung a rag soaked in vinegar above the hearth. Rachel wore the first prototype, a lumpy thing, tied with twine and smelling of wax and sour breath. She looked like a little outlaw, or a ghost. When the storm hit, it sounded like God himself dragging a rake across the roof. Boards rattled. The air turned black. Walter sat by the fire, mask on his lap, hand on Rachel's back, feeling her breathing. Slow, steady. For the first time in 3 nights, she didn't cough. In the morning, the world outside had vanished. Dust draped over everything like ash after a fire. Fences were buried, the barn looked half-eaten, and even the sun was just a smudge behind yellow haze. But inside the Grady home, the air tasted different. Heavy, yes, but not sharp, not choking. Rachel sat on the floor with a biscuit in one hand and the mask in her lap, studying it like it was a toy she didn't quite understand. Walter watched her from the table, sipping weak chicory. He hadn't expected it to work, not fully. But there she was eating, breathing, not coughing. He exhaled through his nose, slowly, almost a prayer. The mask itself was crude. Layers of flour sack, a patch of wool blanket sewn inside, beeswax rubbed into the outer folds to stiffen and seal, the twine ties dug into the back of her neck. Walter made mental notes: soften the lining, adjust the nose flap, make a second one before nightfall. By noon he was back in the barn, sleeves rolled, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt despite the chill. He melted more wax in an old pan, shredded cloth into strips, and cut a new pattern based on how Rachel's breath had condensed inside the first mask. He added a flap that could be lifted when she needed to speak, and used an old suspender to improve the fit. This one looked even stranger, like a muzzle meant for a horse or some kind of furnace trap. Rachel tried it on without a word. The only thing she said was, "This one smells less like vinegar." In town, the talk had already begun. A traveling salesman had seen Rachel in the yard 2 days ago, mask tied tight around her face like some kind of plague doctor. He laughed about it at Crawford's General, called Walter a scarecrow, and said he ought to patent the idea as a joke. Folks chuckled, nervously. After all, they were coughing too. But when Rachel wore the mask to church, things changed. It was the Sunday before Palm. She sat beside Walter in the third pew, hands folded, face covered. During the hymn, a woman leaned over and whispered, "That's not proper." Rachel didn't flinch. When Reverend Chase offered the benediction, Walter noticed 3 more children coughing behind them. That evening, another storm rose over the horizon, red as rust and curling like smoke. Walter sealed the doors, checked the vinegar-soaked rags, and tightened Rachel's new mask. As the wind roared through the cracks in the barn roof, Walter sat awake by the fire again, the mask clutched in his hand. No sound from Rachel, not one cough, the muzzle held. By midsummer, the coughs in town were as common as roosters at dawn. You could hear them before you saw the dust storms deep, barking hacks that rattled windows long before the wind did. Every family had their own concoctions now. Onions boiled in milk, turpentine rubbed on chests, lard mixed with soot and smeared under the nose. None worked. The dust didn't care. It went where it pleased, and still, Walter kept sewing. The barn had become his workshop, a place where the stench of vinegar, beeswax, and old cloth hung thick as fog. The masks lined the rafters in neat rows, each one a little different than the last. Some were shaped like cups, others like snouts. One even had a metal screen fitted inside. Rachel called them breathers, though the townsfolk preferred another word. Muzzles. It was the traveling salesman who took the joke too far. He'd come through on a cloudless Thursday, dust trailing his truck like a bridal veil. Walter saw him from across Crawford's General, standing beside a crate of canned peaches, telling a circle of listeners about the old goose out east of town who's trying to turn his daughter into a hog. Walter didn't respond. He paid for his flour and salt, nodded to Mr. Crawford, and left. But the laughter echoed behind him like stones on tin. Rachel heard about it later, from a neighbor boy. She didn't cry, she'd long since learned not to, but her eyes hardened in a way Walter had seen only once before, the night her mother died, coughing blood into a handkerchief she tried to hide. That evening, Walter sat on the porch, watching the horizon. A long black smear stretched across it, rising like a mountain. He stood slowly, felt the boards tremble under his boots. Another storm. He sealed the windows, pressed wet towels under the doors, and lit the lamp. Rachel sat patiently as he fit the newest mask on her softer wool, tighter seams. The beeswax melted perfectly into the outer layers so it held its shape like armor. It made her look older somehow, more serious than a 10-year-old should ever have to be. By midnight, the storm was screaming. Dust came in waves like water, slamming against the house in dull, angry thuds. The air grew dark as pitch, then darker still. Walter held his breath each time the wood groaned. Then a fist at the door, he froze. No one traveled in storms like this unless they were desperate. Another pounding. Walter pulled the door open just enough to see a shape collapse across the threshold. Thomas Parker, his face gray with dust, coughing so violently it bent him in half. Walter dragged him inside and shut the door tight behind them. Parker couldn't speak, could barely breathe. Walter grabbed one of the early masks, rough, stiff, imperfect, and tied it around the man's mouth. The coughing eased. Outside, the world roared. Inside, the muzzle saved another life. And for the first time since the storms began, Walter felt something he'd forgotten existed. Vindication, but also fear. Because if this storm was only the beginning, then the real cost was still coming. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world carved into strange new shapes. Fences swallowed to their tops. Roofs hunched under dunes. Entire fields turned into deserts of rippled sand. Cows wandered aimlessly, ribs showing through hide. Even the crows were quiet now. They didn't bother flying, in air that scraped them raw. Walter stepped outside with a scarf tied across his mouth, surveying the damage. His fields were gone. His tools buried. The barn stood but leaned like an old drunk. Yet when he turned toward the house, he felt a small pulse of relief. Rachel's mask hung on the clothesline, drying in the fragile breeze. Inside, she was sweeping dust from corners that hadn't been dusted in months. Light spilled through the single uncovered window, soft, filtered, almost kind. Her cheeks held a hint of color again, something Walter hadn't seen since before the storms. He almost smiled. But the moment cracked when a Model A rolled down the dirt lane, coughing smoke. Two men stepped out, city-dressed, wearing polished shoes that instantly sank into the dust. Government men. Walter recognized the type sent to study suffering, not solve it. The taller one approached, clipboard in hand. "You, Walter Grady?" Walter nodded. "We heard you've been trying experimental filtration." Experimental. The word felt like an insult. The man stepped into the house without waiting for permission, eyes scanning the vinegar rags, oiled window seams, and masks drying by the fire. He lifted one of the masks between two fingers as if examining a dead animal. "You design this?" Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man scribbled notes. Interesting. Crude. But interesting. Rachel stood behind her father, mask still hanging around her neck. The man didn't even look at her. "Washington may want household reports," he said. "Possible distribution if conditions worsen." He jotted something else. "Name will be recorded as contributing citizen. Contributing citizen. Not inventor, not savior, just citizen." Walter felt something sink inside him, like a house losing its beams. "Does it work?" the man asked. Rachel spoke before Walter could. "I can sleep," she said simply. The man looked unimpressed. Anecdotal, but noted. They left after 15 minutes, leaving a trail of polished footprints behind them, footprints that filled with dust before the engine even faded. That evening, Walter repaired an old mask by lamplight. The storm had weakened Parker's lungs more than he'd first realized. Others would come. More would need help than he could ever prepare for. Rachel handed him a spool of thread. "Daddy? Why don't folks make their own?" He paused. "Because pride suffocates faster than dust. Because no one wants to admit a fool was right. Because it's easier to blame the wind than fix a broken world." He didn't say any of that. "Because they haven't learned yet," he answered. Rachel nodded solemnly and sat beside him, stitching quietly, the firelight flickering against her mask. Outside, the wind picked up again, soft, warning, restless. Another storm was coming. And Walter sewed faster. By late autumn, the storms no longer frightened Walter. He respected them, yes, the way a man respects a fierce horse, but they no longer held the same chokehold of dread. He knew their rhythms now, the way the sky darkened first at the edges, the way the wind dropped to nothing before rising with a scream, the way the air itself crackled with static just before the first wall of dust hit. He had learned their language, and in return, they seemed to acknowledge the stubborn man who refused to surrender his breath. The neighbors came more often after Parker's collapse. They arrived quietly, with scarves pressed to their mouths, eyes watering, voices hoarse. They asked for masks in whispers, ashamed but desperate. Walter handed out every one he had. Some families returned with small gifts, a jar of beans, a single can of peaches, a broken toy cleaned up for Rachel. Others gave nothing at all, offering only a nod before vanishing again into the blowing grit. Walter didn't keep count. He didn't need payment. Breath itself was the only currency left. By winter, his hands were cracked and bleeding, needle-pricked from endless stitching. Rachel's were too. She had grown careful and confident, sewing the waxed cloth as precisely as he did. More than once he caught her humming while she worked a soft, tuneless hum, the kind children make when the world feels safe enough to imagine things. It soothed him more than any sermon. Yet even as she grew stronger, Walter felt his own chest tighten with each passing week. It began as a pressure, then a heaviness, then a pain that didn't leave. He ignored it at first. Men always do. But by December, he woke coughing in the night, a deep, rattling cough that no mask could soften. Rachel heard it. She always did. She brought him water, laid a cool cloth across his forehead, and sat with him until dawn. He told her it was a cold. She did not believe him. The storms eased that winter. Not because the land healed, it didn't, but because the winds simply grew, tired. Survivors said the plains needed to rest, and maybe that was true. The world had been torn open long enough. Walter spent most of his time inside now, reinforcing the walls, adjusting the seals, teaching Rachel the things he feared he'd soon be unable to teach. She listened closely, memorizing every detail: how to fold the cloth just so, how to melt the wax without burning it, how to check the air for dust by holding it up to a shard of sunlight. On a warm January morning, a rare mercy, he walked with her to the edge of the property. The storms had dragged half the fence down, leaving one lonely post still standing like a soldier who refused to fall. Walter took the very first mask he'd ever made, the crooked, stiff, childish one, and tied it around the fence post, letting the wind catch the loose folds. Rachel frowned. "Why that one?" He rested a hand on her shoulder. "Because it saved your life." She looked at it differently then. Walter Grady died that spring, not from dust but from a winter of strain his heart couldn't bear. Rachel found him in his chair by the fire, hands folded, the last mask he ever stitched lying finished beside him. She buried him under the cottonwood tree, the one still clinging to life despite the storms, and she kept the fences mended, kept the house sealed, kept sewing. Years later, long after the storms had calmed and the wheat returned in fragile green shoots, travelers heading west would sometimes spot a strange sight on the edge of an old Kansas farm: a faded, wax-stiff mask fluttering from a fence post. Most wouldn't know what it meant, but a few would slow their wagons, tip their hats, and whisper, "That's a house where somebody survived."